Okay, welcome everyone to the American Cetacean Society San Francisco Bay Chapter's August speaker event. And I'm Susan Hopp, board member responsible for our speaker program. And I'm here with fellow board member Wade Cobb. And so first, for anyone new to the American Cetacean Society, we are a chapter within a national organization that is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their habitat. And we do this through education, community engagement, and awarding grants towards cetacean research. We appreciate your donations in support of our mission. Donations fund our research grants to scientists, and they support our expenses around monthly talks. So it's easy to donate on our website if you haven't donated at time of registration. So thank you. Now we are recording this session, and please put your questions in the Q&A. That's actually better than the chat. And after the presentation, we'll do our best to get to them. Now, for tonight's talk, Protecting Blue Whales and Blue Skies in California's National Marine Sanctuaries. We are delving into the subject of whale mortality from ship strikes, connecting the dots to the forces leading to these heartbreaking deaths, and importantly, the action underway to mitigate this threat. At the forefront of action in our own region is tonight's speaker, Jess Morten. Jess is the Marine Resource Protection Program Director at the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation and oversees the Marine Protection Program projects that the foundation manages. And these include the Protecting Blue Whales and Blue Skies program, the monthly large whale aerial surveys in the Santa Barbara Channel, and piloting data collection and analysis tools to help inform marine managers and protect marine resources. In her role, Jess supports NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries West Coast whale conservation work across the Channel Islands, Cordell Bank, Greater Farallones, and Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuaries. Jess earned a master's degree in international environmental policy and ocean and coastal resource management in 2015 from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. In 2016, she began working with NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries as the California Sea Grant Fellow with Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. And her prior research focused on behavior and protection of humpback, North Atlantic right, and southern resident killer whales. Jess lives in Santa Cruz with her partner and their 2 dogs, fulfilling her mission to do meaningful work to protect whales and marine ecosystems. And Jess, thank you so much for being here. I of course, first heard you at the Ocean Film Festival and was so excited for the work that you're doing and that we're going to hear about tonight. So thank you, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you so much to the American Cetacean Society San Francisco chapter for allowing me to present to this amazing community. I feel like the San Francisco community is especially engaged on whale conservation work. And as Susan shared, I'm Jess Morten. I work on resource protection projects with the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, as well as NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries in California. And as a lifelong whale and nature nerd, it is really honestly an honor and a dream to get to speak to all of you tonight about the work that I'm really lucky to get to do to protect blue whales and blue skies in California's National Marine Sanctuaries. And so with that, knowing I have a lot I'm hoping to cover tonight, I'm going to get started. Hopefully you should be seeing my slides, and I'm going to move us forward, but let me know if things don't move forward from your end. So just as some context on the groups that I work with really quickly, As I mentioned, and as Susan mentioned, I work with the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and that's a nonprofit research and conservation organization that's based here in California that works in support of the National Marine Sanctuaries in California. And true to that, much of my time and my role is spent directly supporting NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, which is a division of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And so if you look to the screen that I hope is displaying for you, you will see a map that shows you the locations of our national marine sanctuaries around the country and across the Pacific. And at its core, the National Marine Sanctuary System is a nationwide network of 15 national marine sanctuaries and 2 marine national monuments that work to conserve and protect more than 620,000 square miles of unique and spectacular ocean and Great Lakes waters. And then here in California, we are really lucky to be home to 4 amazing national marine sanctuaries that together conserve more than 11,000 square miles of ocean habitat. And so starting from the top of this map, you'll see Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary, Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and then at the southern extent of the map, you'll see Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. And all 4 of these are home to ocean habitat with really rich biodiversity and so much beauty, and everything from cold water coral habitat off of San Francisco to really amazing kelp forests off of Monterey Bay, to the amazing blend of cold and warm water mixing off of the Channel Islands to create really incredible biodiversity down there in that region. And when I mention biodiversity, that definitely includes whale species too. And so in California, we are really lucky to serve as home and important habitat for a number of large whale species. The most commonly cited endangered species in California that you'll see up on the screen now include blue, fin, and humpback whales. And I think probably this group is pretty educated on the whale species that exist in California, but for those who are less familiar, blue whales are definitely the most critically endangered whale population that we see frequently in our home waters, with a population size estimated at around 2,000 individuals. But then we're also home to fin whales, which, despite seeing them every year off of our coastline, we actually don't have great awareness of where they are and what they're doing. Since they are a more elusive species, they tend to be farther offshore than other large whale species. And then lastly, on the right in the images, you see probably the most recognizable species because they're closer to shore are humpback whales, which are comprised of different distinct population segments that visit California, one of which is threatened from the Mexico region and one of which is endangered. I'm sorry, I'm seeing a note. Am I cutting out a little bit? Okay, Wade is saying okay, but
You
let me
sound
know.
all right to me. I don't know. I don't know if other people are experiencing the same thing. Susan, how's it come sound for you?
You sound good to me as well. I'm not sensing any breaking up. So
Okay, well, let me know, and I can turn off my video to save bandwidth if it gets a little questionable.
will do.
But I will keep moving. So again, I'm sure this group is an educated one when it comes to whales and the threats that whales face in our region and around the world. But there are really 3 main human-caused threats that we correlate most often to mortality in California. And the first one listed on the upper left of the screen are ship strikes, which I'm going to focus on tonight for my presentation. But I think it is worth noting that there are these other major threats that these whales face that they're dealing with as we attempt to tackle the issue that are ship strikes. There's all of these other issues that they're also dealing with. And so on the right, entanglements is another big issue here in California and along the US West Coast and other regions. And actually in the image that I've included, it's sort of hard to see, kind of looks like water running off the humpback in that picture, but it's actually a fishing net that's entangled around the head of the humpback. The other issue that I've included in that slide is underwater noise impacts. There's a lot of impacts associated with our human activity when it comes to noise in our ocean habitats. And it's another really major concern, especially because we know, as you can see from this chart, that a lot of our human activity and noise overlaps with the same frequencies that whales are using to communicate. So that's what that chart is showing you, that shipping noise, which is marked at the bottom, and baleen whales, the range that they communicate with or communicate in, tend to overlap, which can really hamper their ability to communicate and cause all sorts of issues for marine life in general. And along with these threats, like with most other marine life and life on this planet, whales face threats from climate change too. It impacts them in a number of ways, especially by changing the marine conditions and impacting the locations of their prey, which largely drives where we expect to see whales. And then you'll also see, of note, habitat degradation is always a concern, and pollution of all kinds is likely to affect all of these whale species, some more than others, but it's something that you always have to keep track of and is always a concern. So, as I mentioned, tonight I'm going to focus most heavily on ship strikes and take you through what we know about ship strikes, what's been done in the past by Sanctuaries and partners, what we're working on this year in 2023, and then I will give you a forecast of what's being planned in the future. But before we dive into that, for those who are interested in interacting throughout this, I know sometimes long presentations can feel hard to get through without interacting in any way. So I have planted some of these QR codes that you see throughout the presentation. And you are welcome to use your smartphones or tablet cameras to open that up into a poll or a questionnaire, and sometimes a web link is what I've attached it to. And so if any of you are unfamiliar with this, all you really need to do is point your camera at this QR code. And when you do that, you should see an option for a link to open up that you can then click on. And in this case, you'll navigate to a poll. And I would love to see your answers as we go through. It's totally up to you. But I will pause here for just a couple seconds for anyone who wants to do that on this first one. All right. So starting first with just some context on what we know about ship strikes. In general, when I talk about ship strikes, I usually like to first frame it as really just an issue of overlap that exists between where vessel traffic exists and where whales are concentrating. And so that's really what the maps that you see on the screen are trying to display. Vessel traffic for 2022 is shown on the left, and the red areas that you see are the higher density areas for vessel traffic. And then if you look to the bottom right, you will see predicted density of blue fin and humpback whales. And that's thanks to work done by Elizabeth Becker at NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service. And unfortunately, with this overlap, it does result at times in collisions between the whales and the ships in these areas. And when it involves really large vessels, like a 1,200-foot container ship, it usually turns out worse for the whales, and it can usually result in a fatal ship strike event, especially if that vessel is traveling at a high speed or high pace. And so as you can see from the chart that you're looking at, since the year 2000, we have seen and recorded 98 ship strikes on all large whale species in California. And if you look at the colors on the chart and reference that legend that's in the upper left, you'll see here that in California, the most commonly recorded species to be hit and killed are actually gray whales. And you'll see that especially in the past 5 years, we've really seen an uptick in gray whale fatalities, especially in the San Francisco regional note. And then that's followed by fin whales, humpback whales, and blue whales. And then in terms of ship strikes on endangered species of whales, so in this case, not including gray whales, since they have, fortunately, in decades past, they have experienced a big population recovery since the time of whaling. So they are not listed as an endangered species. But if you think about just endangered species that I was referencing in some of the earlier slides, you'll see from the map that we have 52 recorded fatal strikes on endangered whales from 2007 to 2022 within California, with most of those fatalities, if you look to the map on the left, being recorded around areas where we have major ports and very concentrated areas of vessel activity. And as the text notes, that ends up coming out to roughly 3.5 endangered whales that are hit and killed each year off of our coastline. But I think a really important point that I always emphasize, and I think most people who speak about ship strikes make sure to emphasize, is that those are just the whales and incidents that we're seeing, which is a really important piece of this story, since most of whales that are hit and killed sink after they are hit and killed. And also most whales that are hit farther offshore that even happen to float are not making their way to their coastlines. Currents aren't bringing them to our shorelines in a way where we can observe and document them as ship strike events. So especially when you look at a map like on the left and you see areas where we're not recording ship strike events, that definitely doesn't mean that ship strikes aren't occurring off of that section of coastline. It usually means vessel traffic is concentrated far enough away from the coastline that whales might be getting hit and aren't making it to the coastline for us to actually document. And so we know that these recorded totals are a major underestimate of how much this is actually happening in our region and around the world. Which is why research partners and experts on this issue at groups like Point Blue Conservation Science have done a lot of work to model what they've actually estimated real actual mortality looks like along our coastline, associated ship strike events. Other researchers have done it in other places around the world. But for our home region on the US West Coast, Point Blue, Cotton Rockwood at Point Blue Conservation Science has worked to do this and has estimated that it's actually closer to 80 endangered whales that are hit and killed by ships each year off of the US West Coast. And you'll see if you look to that table at the top, he estimates that there's 18 blue whales, 22 humpback whales, and 43 fin whales that are hit and killed each season. So thinking back to that last slide with the 3.5 observed events each year, if you look at these numbers, these estimates of actual occurrence bring us to a total that's actually more than 20 times what we're actually seeing and documenting, which gives us a much better sense of the urgency of this issue and gives you a better idea of why Sanctuaries and NOAA is focused on ship strikes on the West Coast. Okay, so now that you have context on the issue, I will take you through what has been done in the past to try to tackle this issue. Before we dive in, again, if you would like to participate, you'll see another QR code that can take you a little recap question if you would like to do it. So I'll give one pause here before I move on in case anyone would like to. And thank you for those of you who are doing it. I can see your answers coming in, so thank you. Okay, so now for what we have done in the past, what Sanctuaries has focused on and what partners have focused on to mitigate this issue. Sanctuaries as a group on the West Coast region understand that a big part of addressing this issue means having a better understanding of where whales are and where they're likely to be. And a lot of that includes focusing on monitoring whale species. And so a lot of monitoring work done by Sanctuaries and partners over the years includes things like monthly aerial surveys for Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, which you'll see a map on the left for January through June 2023. that someone on our team, Anastasia Coons, put together for our aerial survey sightings this year. On the right, you'll see an example of sightings information from boat-based surveys, access ship-based cruises in the San Francisco region that are done on a regular basis in partnership with Point Blue Conservation Science. There's also a ton of acoustic monitoring work going on, and that's done with NOAA partners, Benioff Ocean Science Laboratories partners, Woods Hole partners, the Marine Mammal Center is involved in that, and BARI does their own acoustic monitoring. And then another piece is opportunistic visual sightings data, whether that be from citizen scientists who are just willing to submit whale information on a free app called Whale Alert. Also, we work with whale watch vessels so that they can actually submit sightings information and give us information on when whales are arriving and departing in certain regions. And then lastly, we work very closely with NOAA and other research partners to create models that actually predict density of whales based on the sightings information and then also environmental conditions that are linked to their prey. But in terms of policy action, one of the best ways, not just in California, not just in the US on the East Coast, but around the world to actually avoid having ship strikes happen is to actually work to separate the whales and the ships. And so that's something we have done several times in California. It's something we've done on the East Coast off of Boston. It's something that's been done in the Mediterranean. But we basically work to relocate and extend shipping lanes, as well as extend and create areas where traffic is instructed to route around and not travel within. And so back in 2013, West Coast Sanctuaries worked with the US Coast Guard and made adjustments to the traffic separation schemes off of San Francisco, which is what you see on the left. And then off of the Santa Barbara Channel, or in the Santa Barbara Channel, which is what you see in that middle image. And these changes in 2013 at the time were estimated to have reduced the overlap or the co-occurrence of ships and whales by 15% in Southern California and 60% in the San Francisco region. And all of that is wonderful news and great progress to be made, but because the ocean is a very dynamic place, and especially because changing ocean conditions associated with climate change have caused changes in the distribution of large whales in these areas, the lane placement does need to get reassessed over time. Where we put shipping lanes 10 years ago may not be the best place for them in the current year that we are in, and especially in the future when whales are likely to keep moving to different areas. So with that in mind, the image on the right is showing you actually recent changes that just went into effect. Sanctuaries, again, worked with research partners, with larger NOAA, the US Coast Guard, and also the Department of Defense last year to bring a proposal from the US delegation to the UN body that manages shipping, which is known as the International Maritime Organization, to extend the shipping lanes in the channel. So that's what you see in green, lime green on that map. And then also expand the area to be avoided, which is what you see in red. And those recent changes were adopted last fall and actually went into effect June of this year. But probably the biggest focus of our policy action when it comes to ship strike work is this vessel speed reduction component that I'll focus on. And despite the fact that we spend a lot of time thinking about ways to move shipping away from high density areas of whales, some level of overlap is kind of inevitable, especially because different whale species occupy different places. So putting a shipping lane where it's best for humpback whales may not be the best place for fin whales and vice versa. And so where the overlap of ships and whales is still happening, for over a decade, NOAA has implemented voluntary vessel speed reduction requests to large vessel traffic. And on the screen are the zones that were put out to the mariner community in 2022. And what you see for 2022 has been adapted and expanded so much over the years. to try to include the areas where we know whales are likely to be, and also the time periods when we know they're likely to be around in the highest numbers. And so for Southern California on the right, it's a roughly 250-mile zone that extends from Point Arguello, which is basically Point Conception, all the way down to Dana Point, California. And then for the map on the left for San Francisco region, at the request of the Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank advisory councils, we have these stakeholder groups that actually help inform and provide advice to sanctuary managers. And at their advice, the speed reduction zone, which used to be limited just to the traffic separation scheme, which is in this blue area. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the shipping lanes that are just at the mouth of San Francisco Bay. At their recommendation, the zone was expanded to include all of Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries. And in addition, the timeline was also expanded or extended to account especially for the extended presence of humpback whales that we're seeing in these regions recorded in recent years. And before I move on, I'll also note that these requests mainly go out from NOAA. Sanctuaries does a lot of work to put this together. We do it in partnership with National Marine Fisheries Service arm of NOAA. So it goes out from NOAA at large as an agency, but you'll see there's other logos at the top because this is also done in partnership with the US Coast Guard. And then as a new partnership in 2022, we've also included the Environmental Protection Agency as part of these requests. And I'll touch on this a little bit when I cover some other aspects of this work, but there are significant air emission reduction benefits associated with large vessel traffic slowing down in these areas. It's not just safer for whales, it's also a really positive thing for our coastal air quality. So to understand how we are doing in terms of success with the voluntary requests that we put out to the shipping industry, we spend a lot of time looking at AIS data and ship data to calculate cooperation levels across all of this large vessel traffic. And if you look to the table on this screen, you will see in early years back to 2017, especially in Southern California, cooperation was very low, pretty much hovering right around 20%, which means essentially that all of the distance that large vessels were traveling in these areas, only 20% of that distance was traveled at 10 knots or less, the target speed we were asking them to go. And thankfully, there is a positive trajectory if you keep looking to the right towards 2022. And you'll see that we're at about a 60% level of cooperation across both areas in California in 2022. And for those who are kind of scratching their heads and looking at San Francisco region and wondering why there has been a slight drop, and you'll see 2021, we had 63%, down to 61 in 2022. I won't say I'm celebrating a slight drop in cooperation, but I will note that this happened after the zone went through that major expansion I mentioned. So it went from just in the traffic separation scheme to this major expansion to include the full extent of Cordell Bank and Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuaries. So it wasn't a complete shock to see that asking vessels to slow down across a much larger area did affect overall cooperation a little bit. But because cooperation was so low in the earlier years of putting out these requests from the government agencies, to further motivate greater cooperation with these requests, back in 2014, Sanctuaries began partnering with a whole bunch of awesome partners that include county air district agencies, and namely Santa Barbara County Air Pollution Control District, Ventura County Air Pollution Control District, Bay Area Air Quality Management came on board in later years and have been incredible partners going forward, and then some NGO partners as well. And the goal was to try to implement an incentive-based vessel speed reduction program that we refer to as the Protecting Blue Whales and Blue Skies program. And in recent years, the group I work for, California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, administers this effort. But you'll see from the screen, there's lots of logos going on there. There's lots of great partners that contribute to this program alongside CMSF, California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and Sanctuaries. And In terms of incentives for this program, financial incentives were offered in early years of the program. We would actually get grant money to offer up to the shipping lines, which honestly was the equivalent of pennies to companies that make billions of dollars every year. And we learned after years of putting these financial incentives together that amazingly, they gave a lot of the money back to us. And so we've learned over time and adapted the program over time to really being a positive press incentive campaign. And that's now what we are in the 2023 season. We also provide some pretty cool physical awards. You'll see the photo of the whale tail trophy at the bottom. But we're really just trying to provide a carrot, a positive recognition incentive to enrolled container, car carrier, bulk carrier, and tanker lines that choose to cooperate at a high level with these slow speed requests. And in terms of cooperation and enrollment, I'm happy to report every single year we grow in terms of enrollment. More and more shipping lines choose to come and work with us, especially when they see the amount of recognition that they can receive for slowing down in these areas and showing that they're a whale safe operation. And so on the left, you'll see the 2022 award level shipping lines. We had 23 global shipping lines enrolled in the program in 2022. And together, all of these shipping lines end up representing half of the total distance traveled by all of the large vessels in the area. And collectively, if you look to the chart on the right, you will see that their fleets ended up achieving a cooperation rate of 78% in the 2022 season. So almost 80% cooperation across the companies that chose to sign up and participate in this program, which for a voluntary program that has container lines that represent roughly 90% of all container activity, it's pretty amazing to see. And then in terms of benefits, obviously we're not just doing this for no reason. We're not just trying to slow down commerce because we feel like it. There are significant benefits associated with this effort. And the one that NOAA is obviously most focused on are the whale conservation benefits. And so in the 2022 season, if you looked at the text on the screen, thanks to Point Blue Conservation Science, we know what the estimated reduction in ship strike risk is associated with the slowdowns of those shipping lines that choose to enroll in the program. And it achieved an estimated reduction of 44% in the 2022 season compared to their baseline speeds outside of the season timeline. And then we also partner, we're really lucky to partner with the Scripps Whale Acoustic Laboratory. Vanessa Zobel, Dr. Vanessa Zobel, is a researcher we work with to actually measure the sound levels associated with these slower transits in Southern California. And so you'll see we had an average measured reduction in underwater noise of 4.6 decibels per transit in the 2022 season. And then, as I mentioned, there are also some pretty amazing air conservation or air emission reduction benefits associated with these slower speeds. And so we work with our air district partners and also Starcrest Consulting, which is a group that works quite a bit with all of the ports around the country to do emission reduction calculations. And we look at what the emission reduction benefits are associated with these reduced speeds. And as you'll see listed on this slide, since 2014, the program has achieved emissions reductions of over 100,000 tons of regional greenhouse gas emissions. We've achieved reductions of over 3,200 tons of smog-forming NOx emissions. And I'm definitely not an emissions expert. I'm a total whale girl, but our air district agency partners have always made sure to mention and highlight to us that this program has been a really important part of their strategy to meet attainment standards for harmful air emissions for coastal air quality purposes. And that's especially important in Southern California, where smog and particulate matter really threatens coastal air quality. And that especially happens in summer and fall months, which coincidentally works out really well for the timeline of the season, because that's also typically when the whale populations we're most concerned about are feeding off of our coastline. And then before I move on to 2023 season, one really exciting component of this program that honestly, I wish I had 30 minutes just to talk about this, or have my colleague Amber take over and talk about this, is the brand ambassador campaign that we work on, where we work to engage the corporate sector on the benefits of working with cargo ships that choose to operate at slower speeds off of our coastline. And this came to be really because we learned over the years that we can be pretty effective in convincing the shipping lines to change behavior and slow down for whales and air quality. But we know it's a lot more meaningful to hear that request from their customers and their clients, and the groups essentially that are putting cargo on their cargo ships. And so it's a pretty young campaign, but we've worked to bring on brands that you see in the graphic on the left. And we ask them to sign on, prioritize whale safer supply chain operations, and really just help us recognize the award level shipping lines for doing the right thing and slowing down in these areas off of California. And I'll make this appeal probably several times in the presentation, but as I share this information, I definitely want to put the request out there to anyone listening that if you have any connections to brands who move cargo to the West Coast that might be interested in coming on board, please let us know. We just signed Sonos last month, which is a really big win since they're a big name in the world of sound equipment and high quality speakers. But if you're willing, please reach out to me or our team after this presentation if you have any brands that might be interested in helping us raise awareness on this effort. All right, and now I'll move to 2023 season. And once again, if you would like to use the QR code, it's another recap question on the methods that we've used to reduce ship strike risk in California. So I'll pause for a second if anyone wants to do that. And I think I am seeing a few other folks saying they are having sound issues. Are you still hearing me okay, Susan?
Yes, I'm not having any issues. Wade, are you?
No, it still sounds good to me.
Okay, awesome.
I mean, if we're hearing sound difficulties from many, I mean, we could, I gather potentially, you could turn off video, but that typically shows would come in other ways, I think. I don't know. I'm not really the expert. So maybe just carry on.
Okay, I'll do it. But if there are other folks who are having issues, please put it in the chat and I will turn off my camera and hopefully fix the problem. Okay, so for 2023 season, we're currently within the vessel speed reduction season in California, which again runs from May 1st through December 15th. And we had some really big geographic changes that went into effect this year, including, if you look to the map on the left, you'll see it looks familiar to what I showed before, but it includes this really big expansion to include Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And this was done again at the request of the Sanctuary Advisory Councils. The Monterey Bay Sanctuary Advisory Council asked the superintendents to consider joining the vessel speed reduction requests, especially backed by data from research partners at Point Blue Conservation Science that suggested that would be a really helpful thing to reduce risk in the region. But it was also done partly in response to the very tragic and very public death of the beloved humpback whale Fran that washed up on the shores last year after a recorded ship strike event. And for the addition, it actually adds almost 6,000 square miles of slow speed area to California, which contributes to a total of over 20,000 square miles across California, where we're asking large vessel traffic to slow down. That includes the Southern California zone as well. And then also probably less noticeable, but Southern California zone was also expanded slightly 10 miles to the west to include shipping lane extension that I mentioned earlier, and also the area to be avoided expansion that I mentioned. So once those IMO changes went into effect, we expanded the zone to actually include the extended areas that they contained. And we're not done with the season, so there's nothing official that's been calculated yet for 2023, but I am happy to report that preliminary cooperation calculations for the regions show that cooperation for San Francisco and for Southern California is around 65%. So again, that's up from around 60% that we recorded in 2022. And then for the new area that isn't Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, we're seeing a cooperation level, at least in the early months of the season, of a 55% cooperation level. So again, slightly lower than the historical areas where we've asked vessels to slow down, which is not incredibly surprising given that it's a huge new area and awareness honestly might not be as common across all of the shipping lines as these historic areas where they've been asked to slow down for several years. And then one other new component of the voluntary vessel speed reduction requests that we put into effect this year, in the theme of what I was sharing earlier, where we're always trying to reduce co-occurrence where we can, is we have this new component of the requests where we actually ask for a routing request, a voluntary routing request for large vessel traffic to prioritize use of the western approach into San Francisco Bay. So if you look at the traffic separation scheme, there's 3 spokes that all meet in the center at the mouth of San Francisco Bay. And we're asking vessel traffic to prioritize use of that middle spoke to reduce mainly the overlap of shipping traffic that if you see for the northern lane here, shipping does fan out for that northern lane right over this very dark blue area that represents a high predicted blue whale density area. And it's really new. This has only been in effect since May, and this is the first year we've ever asked vessel traffic to do a routing change like this. But preliminary analyses that you'll see represented by the pie charts on the right show that there has been a slight increase in the use of the western lane, about a 10% increase. April months are before the season went into effect, so you'll see 2022 and 2023 were roughly the same. And then for May 2023, when the season started, we did see this slight increase in voluntary use of this western approach. And then another really exciting component that we've included this year for 2023 is we formed an official partnership with friends of ours at the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratories, which is a group based out of University of California, Santa Barbara. They are funded by Salesforce founder Mark Benioff, and they operate a really cool website that I'll have a link included at the end for you guys, but it's whalesafe.com for those who just want to type it in and check it out. But one thing they really do well is automated compliance analyses. And so we've partnered with them to create what you see on the screen, which are automated reporting to the participating shipping lines in the Protecting Blue Whales, Blue Skies program. And our hope with this is that with increased engagement and information to these participating companies, we will see some increased cooperation. And this is something we used to provide mid-season updates and end of season updates, but we're hoping that more regular updates to the shipping lines to make them aware of how each vessel in their fleet is performing might be useful for them, especially in terms of communications to their fleet, to let them know, even if they look at these maps, if there's a problem area for a certain vessel, they can let them know, hey, are you aware that the zone was expanded in this region? We'd really like you to go 10 knots or less throughout the entire zone. So this is a really exciting development that is only possible thanks to this partnership with the Benioff Ocean Science team. And then one other exciting, still in progress effort that is underway, led by the US Coast Guard District 11 team, is this work to place offshore fairways off of the West Coast. So there's this process called the Pacific Coast Port Access Route Study, or PAC-PARS. And prior to this work, if you remember the map I showed in the beginning, we always have these traffic separation schemes that are really close to the mouths of the ports, but there really isn't a designated highway or area for large vessel and commercial vessels to travel farther off the coast. And so this is an attempt to try to consolidate traffic, organize traffic for navigational safety reasons, And so NOAA has been actively involved in consulting with the Coast Guard for this year and last year. And at this point, a proposed design has been put out by the Coast Guard. It will take several years for them to codify the designs and finalize them. But this is something we've been consulting with them on because, again, we're always trying to achieve the goal of rerouting and placing vessel traffic farther away from where we know whales are likely to be. All right, I'm already taking longer than I meant to, so now switching to my final section as I wrap it up here. But again, this is not a poll this time for the QR code, but it's going to take you to the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory's WhaleSafe website if you'd like to use it. Again, you can just type in whalesafe.com. That might even be easier. But great resource to get near real-time whale information on where whales are being detected. It's also a great tool, like I said, to understand how shipping lines are performing with the voluntary requests that we're putting out there. So for looking ahead, I'll try to do these ones quickly, but these are just emerging areas of research related to this work that I think are really exciting. And one area of emerging interest, not just for sanctuaries, but for lots of groups, involves thinking about the carbon benefits of whales, their carbon storage benefits and sequestration benefits associated with healthy whale populations. And so in collaboration with research partners, efforts are underway by my colleagues at Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuaries and Greater Farallones Association to quantify the carbon storage and sequestration benefits. And the stats that you see included on the screen are from a blue carbon report that's accessible online that was put together by my very wonderful colleague, Sarah Hutto. And actually the QR code on this slide should take you straight to that report if you are interested in learning more. And then another emerging project that is really early stages, but is so exciting, I felt like I had to share it, was this effort that's being led by partners at the Nature Conservancy and researchers at UPC in Barcelona, and led by my colleague Anastasia Kunz for our California Marine Sanctuary Foundation and the Sanctuaries team. And it's just a satellite monitoring project that uses an archive of high definition satellite imagery that we are lucky to get within NOAA from Maxar, which is a satellite imagery based company. And the UPC researchers, along with TNC, have worked to create a machine learning algorithm that actually automatically detects whale presence in that imagery. And so obviously pouring through hundreds and thousands of images manually to try to find tiny pixels that represent a whale at the surface is a huge undertaking. But for AI and for machine learning, it's really easy once you've trained the AI to know what to look for. So something we're really excited to see advancing. And again, still in beginning stages, but pretty cool to imagine how this detection work can help us understand all sorts of things, including the seasonal arrival and departures of key whale species in our region. And then one more exciting project that I wanted to mention, again, led by my colleague Sarah Hutto with the Greater Farallones Association team, is one centered on engaging marine protected area managers and indigenous leaders across the Eastern Northern Pacific. And the goal is to try to collaborate to protect whales from ship strikes across their entire migratory range. And so the images on the screen here are actually from a report from World Wildlife Fund that pulled together tagging data to show significant migratory corridors for endangered whales. But again, the goal of this workshop, as I mentioned, is really to try to bring these managers together across this space to share information on the urgency of ship strikes, because maybe some of them aren't aware that that's an issue that is in their ocean backyard, share lessons learned on effective measures to reduce risk, and then also coordinate on a cohesive, coordinated strategy that can conserve whales throughout their extended range instead of just in our smaller protected spaces. And now I am getting close to the end, I promise, but looking ahead, wanted to leave you with some potential changes to the vessel speed reduction work in California and just leave you with some things that Sanctuaries, partners, larger NOAA are considering and always talking about in the California region to add to whale conservation effectiveness. And as you'll see on the screen in the bullets, those changes include consider expanded speed reduction zones in California, especially in areas that aren't currently covered in between the zones that we have in California, and San Diego is a region that currently isn't covered, for example. Consider extended timelines for speed reduction requests. As I noted, they're typically in place May 1st through December 15th, but we do definitely have some years where humpbacks arrive much earlier. We have years even when fin whales are present in earlier months of the year. The third is to consider mandatory speed regulations, since these are all voluntary requests on the West Coast. And for those who are familiar with the East Coast, there are regulations in place for ship speeds. And that's mainly linked to the fact that there's a very critically endangered North Atlantic right whale population on that coastline with a lot more data to prove the urgency of the issue, but it's still something that many researchers argue is necessary for California as well. Consider expanding the Protecting Blue Whales and Blue Skies program to other regions. So consider exporting this model of an incentive-based program to places that don't have it yet. And then lastly, to continue to engage brands in the corporate sector on supply chain impacts to whales, expand that brand ambassador initiative that I was talking about earlier. And then one of the last slides here, when I listen to long talks, I always want to hear about ways I can get involved. So I wanted to leave you all with some options for how you can help us on this work if you feel inclined to. One of the first ways is just help us spread the word that ship strikes are an issue and that our collective consumer behavior has impacts on these endangered whales. I definitely urge everyone who doesn't already have whale alert on their phones, who might be in places where you have potential whale sightings, please download Whale Alert and submit sightings. It comes directly to us, thanks to partners at Conserve.io and Point Blue. Third bullet is sign our petition if you're interested. We have a petition out there. If you go to that website, you can actually access the petition and see other ways you can get involved with the program and the community. And then I already made this appeal, but I'll do it again. If you know any brands that move cargo to the West Coast that you could put us in touch with, it's a whole lot easier to convince them to come on as brand ambassadors if we have a connection with someone like you who can introduce us rather than a cold call. So please let us know and reach out. And then lastly, please consider just following us on LinkedIn and Instagram, because we're always trying to widen our community of supporters. And then before I finish up, just because it would be very foolish and honestly inappropriate of me to finish without acknowledging so many colleagues that make all of this work possible. I first wanted to say a huge thank you to the NOAA Sanctuary team in California and the West Coast region specifically, especially Sean Hastings and Michael Carver. They have given so much to this work, and honestly, none of it would have happened and been where it was and where it is without their leadership on it. To my California Marine Sanctuary Foundation team, to Robert Mazurek and Amber and Anastasia and others, thank you so much for the time you guys put on these projects. To our Blue Whales, Blue Skies partnership, I mentioned we have great partners, Air District partners included, but they've been really integral to the success of this program existing, and we're so grateful to them for that. And then finally, to our many research partners, whether it be Point Blue Conservation Science, who I've mentioned all over the place in this webinar, our Scripps Whale Acoustic Lab partners, Callie and Rachel at the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory team, and so many others. This work would not be possible without them. So thank you to all of you, and hopefully I represented our work appropriately tonight. But I will close it there. But thank you so much for sticking with me across the last 45 minutes. And I included one more QR code because I guess I love QR codes. But this one is just to bring you to a form if you'd like to fill it out that lets you join our foundation mailing list and basically just keeps you informed on activities related to this work. And then anyone who's interested, my email is listed. Please follow up. I covered a ton here, but if you have questions, feel free to reach out directly.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess. And do we have time for a few live questions? There was a good amount coming in from folks attending. I think we do. I will, Jess, do you mind, I tried bucketing them as much as I could, but you mind if I fire a few at you? And if there's any, I think the first bucket is kind of on general speed reduction and kind of voluntary speed reduction questions.
Sure.
The one I got 4 or 5 times was, what's a barrier to, I guess kind of generally, what's a barrier to making the speed reductions laws versus voluntary? Are the shipping companies lobbying? Is there, what's kind of the major thing that's restricting that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one we get asked all the time. And I mentioned this a little bit, but where we already have regulations in place on the East Coast is an area where we have a really critically endangered population of North Atlantic right whales. You know, we're down to around 300 individuals left for that population. And the critically endangered status of them definitely supports more urgent action from NOAA. So that's one piece of it. The other piece that is unfortunately important is that there's just a lot more evidence amassed at this point that ship strikes are an urgent issue for right whales. They're one of the few whale species that float after they're hit and killed. They're positively buoyant species compared to the ones we have here on the West Coast that tend to sink. And so they were able on the East Coast to create this track record of how urgent of a problem it was, in a way that we are now starting to do more effectively with the models I've mentioned. But it's still a really tough case to make when you don't actually have bodies on the beach that back up your point. And there's a ton of work. There's so many partners who are constantly thinking about this and trying to arm NOAA with enough information to actually take action in that way. And the sanctuaries in the San Francisco region for Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank, actually at the recommendation of the Sanctuary Advisory Councils, are considering regulations in the next management plan review process. I can't promise that that's something that will happen, but it's definitely something that's being discussed internally and talked about more and more each year.
Makes sense. And then just kind of for context, what's the aside, like when the ship speeds are reduced through kind of the critical areas to 10 knots, what kind of percent decrease in total travel time would that be for going up for like say a trip from LA to SF Bay, if the like normal speed without any restriction versus the 10 knots, what's kind of the disruption for the shipping companies?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not, you know, it doesn't add days to their transits, but it is hours. And it really depends. If you're a vessel that was traveling at 20 knots across that distance and we're asking you to go 10 knots, it can add upwards of 8 hours to your transit time across that area, which is a big problem when you have very tight times that you have to make at the ports and you have your labor assignments planned in advance. And if you miss it near a shipping line, it's extremely expensive to miss that window of opportunity to come into port. So it does depend. In general, most of the shipping traffic, especially for container traffic, it's starting to slow down off of our coastline. There's a number of reasons that's happening, but honestly, one of the main reasons is they're just more efficient at slower speeds. There's an optimal speed for traveling for these cargo ships, and they end up using less fuel at slower speeds, around 12 knots. 10 to 12 knots is honestly more optimal for them than 20 knots. And so we've seen, especially as they're focused on reducing carbon emissions, they are tending to opt to do slow steaming in these areas. But for those who haven't had the ability to build in the extra time to their scheduling, it's a big ask. It's a lot of hours added. That being said, there's also been a lot of really good research done by economists in the San Francisco region and the Southern California region to actually look at what the true cost to industry is that factors in the time added, the fuel saved. And when they do the math on all this stuff with the fuel savings, it's basically no cost added to the shipping lines. It's a really marginal increase in cost because they're saving on fuel even though they are keeping the cargo on their ships on board longer. And so I think it's different for every shipping line. I talk to a lot of them on a regular basis, and some of them have really tight windows that are hard for them to work with and slow down for, and other ones it's easier for them to accommodate, and they're honestly excited to be able to do something that makes their supply chain whale safer and more environmentally friendly.
Makes sense. And kind of on a similar token, when how are the speeds monitored and verified, whether it's on the East Coast where it's a law or out here where it's kind of just for the data purposes to track the voluntary adoption?
Yeah, so it's a lot of my job, honestly, is looking at this data that gives us the speeds of all of the vessels in the area. And it's based on AIS data, automatic identification system data. So this is basically a transponder system that large vessels, any vessel that's 65 feet or larger, is required to carry AIS. And these transmissions that go out from all the ships provide not just the location of where they are, but also the speed over ground that they're traveling at. And so we end up collecting at the end of the season and throughout the season, hundreds of millions of data points for every vessel out there, and aggregating them for each vessel and for each shipping line and for all of the large traffic taking place, so we can get an understanding of what compliance and cooperation looks like.
Awesome, that makes sense. And then as far as kind of, you mentioned some ways that we could get involved. There was a question about if it's helpful to write local government officials or, you know, company executives, anything like that would be helpful to help kind of get things closer to law.
Sure. I mean, I always welcome it. Honestly, any participation from the public to show that this is something that the public cares about, I think is a great thing. There hasn't been a ton of attention to the issue of ship strikes on the West Coast. I think on the East Coast, where right whales are such a concern, and there's just been, again, a better track record, a clearer track record of how much of a problem it is. There has been more movement from the public to put pressure on the government to make moves towards regulations. And so I think anything we can do to raise awareness on the West Coast, this is happening out here too. And I definitely welcome all of you reaching out to our legislators, whether it be our state representatives or our federal representatives.
Got it. And there's also one on kind of the, I guess, effectiveness on of low speeds. Like, is there I don't know if you had a chart in there or anything. Is there like a difference analysis of like the effect on a whale that gets hit at 15 knots versus 10 or anything like that?
Yeah, I didn't include it in this presentation, but most of the research that we point to for the East Coast work that NOAA operates for the right whale protections and for the West Coast to protect whales here in California, we refer to research that was done back in 2013, where they actually looked at a bunch of observed ship strike events and looked at the speeds vessels were traveling when they hit whales to determine what speeds were most correlated with a lethal ship strike versus one that the whale survived but maybe got injured. And the findings from that research suggest that if a large vessel is traveling at 10 knots, it reduces the risk of a lethal strike by 50%. So it doesn't guarantee that if a 1,200-foot container ship hits a whale at 10 knots that the whale is going to survive, but it gives them a fighting chance and reduces the risk by 50%. That's the commonly held belief on that topic.
And I assume it probably reduces the amount of strikes too by a pretty similar number, right?
It also lets them get out of the way too, which is a really important component. Yep.
Sense. And then I guess moving slightly different, I'm trying to bucket these in categories, but they're a little bit, the rest are going to be a little bit all over the place. So NOAA in the 2022-2023 popular estimate for grays was about 14.5 thousand, which is about equal to where the counts began in 1960. And that's due to multi-year unusual mortality rate. Your graph shows that the high gray whale strike deaths may argue for including them in your program. Do you have any comment on that?
No, I think it's a great point, and it's definitely something being talked about. Gray whales are definitely going through hard times right now. They are experiencing what you mentioned, an unusual mortality event where we are seeing an increase in the number of malnourished gray whales along our coastline, the increase in ship strikes and entanglements. From what I understand from researchers on this topic, it does seem like there is a pattern of gray whales roughly every 10 years having some sort of dip in population size, since there's theories that they hit a carrying capacity at some point, and may have done that prior to this unusual mortality event. But there's a ton of extra concern added on in recent years because climate change is influencing presence of Arctic sea ice, which is linked to their main prey source. And so I think that's a very valid concern and something that folks are talking about. We're not at a level where we're losing enough gray whales where there's many discussions on listing them as a threatened or endangered population, but we certainly don't want to see them on a trajectory where they might have to be listed as a threatened or endangered population. So one way to potentially help that situation would be to target them in some of these policy efforts, like voluntary vessel speed reduction, which we could consider implementing in the winter months of the year, where right now there is no vessel speed reduction request in place. So I appreciate the question. I think it's a good one, and we are definitely talking about that.
Makes sense. And are there any theories for why fin whale numbers have, kind of specifically fin whales, have grown so much in the mortality estimates?
Well, I think it's still up for debate. I don't think anyone really knows for sure. If you remember, if I go back to the map, and maybe I can actually go back there. If I go back to that map I shared on where we see ship strikes happening off of California, sorry, probably making you dizzy. So many slides, there it is. Fin whales on this map are shown in red. And so you'll note for fin whales, I mean, we have a few offshore examples, but we tend to see fin whales coming in on the bows of ships more than other species, which is kind of interesting. We actually have most of the fin whale ship strike records that are included in this map are instances, basically what you see in this image, where a fin whale was draped across the bulbous bow of a big ship coming into one of these ports. And I don't think anyone knows for sure if it means that fin whales are actually getting hit more, or if they are just anatomically shaped in a way where they're more likely to get caught because they're long and thin, or thinner, I guess, relatively to the other whale species that we're talking about here in California. So I don't have a great answer on that, but they may just have bodies that lend themselves to getting stuck on the front of the ships when they are hit and killed, which means we tend to have better evidence of them getting hit in general.
Thank you. And then as far as kind of other methods of prevention, is there any form of alert system for large commercial vessels that there could be a whale nearby, whether it's through like whale safe or whale alert or something like that?
Definitely. And we're really interested in that. The Benioff Ocean Science Laboratories team has actually worked with some of the shipping lines directly to basically set it up so that they're streaming some of that whale detection information straight to their navigation systems, so that they know as soon as there's a whale heard on their hydrophone, as soon as somebody has sighted a whale in the region, they have that information in front of them as they're coming in through the region. There's other options out there that we think are really worth pursuing. There's ways to communicate with vessels, including over the system I mentioned for tracking speed. AIS is not just a way for us to get information on the ship speeds and locations. It's also a way to communicate with all of the vessels that are operating off our coastline. It's one of the ways that the Coast Guard and the vessel traffic services teams that operate traffic along the coastline communicate with ships. And so that's one thing we're really interested in is there a way that we can use that AIS messaging system to let them know when they've entered a vessel speed reduction zone. If they're maybe going faster than 10 knots, let them know that they're in a zone and request that they slow down. And in addition, is there a way for us to actually put icons through that system on their maps that shows there was a whale sighting here? And whenever possible, reduce speed and maybe reroute around the area where whales have been sighted.
Awesome, thank you. Only a couple more. I know I'm firing questions, but is there a known or speculated reason for kind of the dip 2020? It seems like 2018 and 2019 we're super high, and then obviously 21 and 22. Was that a COVID thing, or was there another reason for that?
I assume you mean for the stranding chart?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I honestly should have mentioned it on my own because I think it's incredibly misleading without this caveat. But yes, definitely yes, there is a big decrease in observed ship strike events in 2020, as you will see. And that is largely associated with the fact that the teams who can actually go on scene and diagnose what the cause of death is associated with any whales that wash up on our shorelines, they couldn't mobilize. And that's in the San Francisco region. That's organized largely by the Marine Mammal Center. They help manage a lot of this process. The California Academy of Sciences is also heavily involved in this. And during COVID, people weren't allowed to mobilize and go do those things. So 2020 was not a year that I think whales were especially safe, but I actually think risk may have increased in 2020 because if you all remember, Americans started ordering way more stuff during COVID because we all needed to add to our home gyms and keep ourselves occupied and entertained. And so there was actually an increase in shipping traffic off of our coastline, but there were way fewer people out there to actually document the impact of that increase in traffic. So thank you for that question. It's a great one that I should have mentioned.
Absolutely. And then I guess last one is a two-parter. One, are most of the commercial companies or the container companies that you're looking at or that are kind of active in the area, US based or international? And B, do you have like a target list of critical kind of companies that you're looking to get in touch with next that folks can go after to try to get them involved?
Yeah, so there are a couple US flagged container lines and a few car carrier lines, but the majority are international. Everywhere from Asian-based companies to Europe-based companies. Some of the biggest ones in the world are Europe-based shipping lines. So it's really a mixed bag there. And we absolutely have a priority list of companies that we're always trying to target to get more involved. When we pull all of the data at the end of the season, as I was noting, all of that AIS data, we look at what the distance traveled of each of the shipping lines are, and we actually do go down that list and prioritize some of our communications based on who's traveling the farthest within the zones. I'm happy to report that most of the shipping lines that have significant mileage in these areas are engaged on this effort and are slowing down and are either performing at a really high level or are increasing their performance level every year that we engage them on this. There are a few shipping lines that, for whatever reason, operational constraints, scheduling concerns, different routing issues, are just not seeming to slow down and haven't come to join us on this effort. But they very much are on a priority list where we're always trying to convince them to get more involved and care more about this issue.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I know that was a lot of questions and kind of coming from all directions, but I think that's it, and really appreciate it and such an awesome talk. I'll pass it back to Susan if she has any closing remarks.
Yeah, I did want to just mention that this bill actually sponsored by my assembly representative Damon Connolly in California, AB 953. And I'm just wondering, Jess, you've been talking about what you're doing, but it essentially, it did just pass, and it creates a statewide voluntary vessel speed reduction and sustainability shipping program to reduce air pollution and deadly strikes. I mean, it sounds like that's what you're already doing. And I'm just wondering, is that legislation, are you aware of it? Is it going to help your efforts?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning it. It was legislation that was originally co-authored by not NOAA, but by some of our air district partners. The Bay Area Air Quality Management District team helped write the original draft legislation. It's not necessarily something that would change much because, as you're noting, Susan, it's basically bolstering what's already in place. It's not totally clear at this point what the final bill will include. There's some potential benefits that might be appealing to this group to hear. I mean, it's possible that the bill will mandate that the state expand the areas where we currently have zones to actually be statewide. Because right now, if you remember my maps, there's just specific areas, especially within national marine sanctuaries, and then that area in Southern California where vessels are asked to slow down. And so it could result potentially in some significant geographic expansions, but it's definitely focused on voluntary. It would bolster the existing Blue Whales, Blue Skies program. I think that's ending up being included in the legislation, that it wouldn't create something new. It would support what's already existing. I think from a selfish perspective for our partnership, we were always hoping that it would also include a significant funding mechanism for the program, because right now we operate on a grant-based program. We have to go out and get foundation funds from family foundations. Honestly, sometimes we get lucky and we'll get money from supplemental environmental program funds from California Air Resources Board. That's kept us alive as a program for several years. But I think that was our initial hope with the legislation, is that it would promise a stable funding mechanism for the incentive program for the future. And in the current versions I've seen, that is not how it's written, which is kind of a bummer to see. So I would love to see more pressure on the legislators, the state legislators, to actually include funding for the program. But at this point, I'm certainly not against it. Even just raising awareness on the effort is always a good thing. And it would also mandate that state agencies like the Ocean Protection Council would be an official partner on the effort with us, which I think would be a great thing.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully then it is a springboard. And I do think it's an opportunity for people to, wherever you may live, to, especially in the state of California, to reach out to your own political leaders and say, this is great, but let's take it the next step and really put some funding behind it. So, and I will give that information to Damon Connolly for that. So yeah, I think using our voice, especially in a situation like this, is just so important. And anyway, thank you, Jess, so much for all the work you're doing. It's so inspiring, and the collaboration and the acknowledgements of to all the other partners and dedicated teams working on this. And yeah, we can all do something. That's for sure. And I was just going to mention finally that, of course, I met you right after the showing of the Collision, that great documentary. And that, I think, is a good recommendation for anybody that wants to hear more about this. It's a magnificent documentary that actually looks at the issue worldwide. So with that, thanks again, Jess, and we hope to see you all in September. And we have a really exciting talk from actually one of our board members, marine biologist Mark Weber, on what we can learn from sexual behavior of porpoises to habitat and protection. So thanks again, Jess.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good night.
All right, onward.